Today I'm speaking with David Bernstein. And David, you're an author, professor, podcaster, and speaker, and you have spoken broadly about left-wing anti-Semitism, as well as CRT, and many of the issues that are prevalent right now in our culture. And I'm really looking forward to getting your perspective on this. Could you start by saying a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yes, you got it right, except for professor.
I saw you shake your head a little bit, so
right.
that's
there's another David Bernstein named David E. Bernstein, who is a professor at George Mason. We write about similar topics. We have very similar interests. We're friends, and we're confused with each other about 2 to 3 times a week. So, so it's par for the course.
Well, my apologies for that. Thank you for the correction.
Sure. So I've been in the world of Jewish advocacy my entire career. In 2021, I left as CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which was an umbrella of local Jewish advocacy organizations. And I started a new organization called the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values because I worried that there was this ideology, whatever you want to call it, critical race theory or wokeism or radical social justice ideology. Actually, people are increasingly saying, and I like it, the oppressor binary. And so I'm using that a lot nowadays. I started this new organization to push back against that in the Jewish world at first, but then to start pushing back at it in the larger society, where I saw it really wreaking havoc in schools, in particular, K through 12 and college campuses. So we've gotten very focused on K through 12 schools and have really built a program around that. And I wrote a book in 2022 called Woke Antisemitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews, and have just generally written a lot about that topic.
Well, what would you say are the misconceptions around this topic that you encounter in the public?
Yeah, so people talk a lot of, there's this reaction to the word woke, and my book is called Woke Antisemitism. And I don't care if someone wants to use a different word besides woke. If you want to call it something different, fine, as long as we understand what we're talking about. I'm talking about an ideology that tends to divide up the world neatly into oppressed and oppressors, and define exactly who's oppressed by virtue of their identity, and to define exactly who the oppressors are by virtue of their identity, and also claims that people with lived experience of oppression get to define the world for the rest of society because they're the only ones who are experiencing the oppression, and the rest of us are sort of clueless about it. So that's the basic structure of the ideology I'm talking about. It's spread a lot in society, and I'm trying to get people to understand how it's spread, what its implications are. I've been especially concerned about the Jewish community. I want them to understand that this ideology really flies in the face of our sort of core liberal principles as a community. Liberal, but meaning that free expression of ideas and openness to different thoughts, free thought. And that's so key to who Jews are, but it's also an important operating system for the rest of society. People need to be able to exchange their ideas. So I'm worried that people, when they hear the word woke, they think, okay, this is a right-wing conspiracy to go after the left or whatever. And that it is true some of the time. There are right-wing people who are abusing the term in a way and calling anything that they don't like coming from the left woke. But woke does mean something, and it can mean something. And if we want to find a different word, that's fine too. But I really think it's important that people understand what we mean by this ideology and why it's a problem for society and for particular communities.
And when you mentioned that you want Jews to understand how this is antithetical to your values and principles, do you feel like there's a split within the Jewish community where some have gotten pretty woke, as you say?
Some have gotten pretty woke and some have gotten pretty anti-woke. I go around talking about these issues to Jewish groups. And granted, this is not necessarily rank and file people. These are people highly active in Jewish life. So these are people who tend to be very committed to Israel, committed to Jewish thriving and well-being. But these are people who tend to be liberal as well, or even progressive. And I'm seeing that they're experiencing a kind of crisis in identity, political identity these days. And many of them are saying, I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know where I fit in society anymore. And so that's a large swath of American Jewry. I think a lot of the Jewish organizations may feel similarly, but are having trouble sort of pivoting because they've had these long-standing relationships with progressive allies, and they're fearful of alienating them. They're fearful of being alone in American society. I do think that the Jewish community is in a state of flux around these issues. And part of my role, I think, is to get them to understand that there's this emerging threat. It's a threat that we've seen in spades since October 7th. It's this threat that when people divide up the world so neatly into oppressed and oppressors, they're going to see a Jewish community that is largely successful, on average is successful, as part of the oppressor class, because that's how this worldview operates. And I think that's very dangerous, and I think it's giving rise to a variant of anti-Semitism that we're seeing in our lives. And I think it's time for our community to connect the dots. So I do believe that there are people who are woke themselves, quite woke themselves. I think there are other people who I might call a joke that are woke adjacent. There are people who, they're not so bought into the ideology, but they don't want to alienate anybody, particularly on the left. They've been on the left their whole lives. And, why put ourselves at odds with our left-wing allies? And then there are people who sort of see the problem but are scared to speak out about it. And then there are people like me who see the problem and need to speak out about it and will speak out about it. So I think we're pretty divided these days.
Yeah, the division you're talking about, that polarization, it feels like we're seeing that quite a bit in modern culture. And do you have a sense of when you started to realize, how did you start to recognize this, and where do you think that it came from? How do you see this having developed?
Yeah. So I started seeing this. I probably saw elements of it when I was in college. Maybe I took a women's studies class where I thought I could question the professor, and the professor said, oh no, this is the right answer about, patriarchy or whatever. It came from the same ideological place as what we're experiencing now. It just wasn't nearly as prevalent. In the late 1990s, I was part of a leadership group of nonprofit, for-profit, and government leaders, young leaders mostly. And we were learning about all these topics that affected our community and whatever. And we had Multicultural Day. And I remember the facilitator got up in front of the group and he said, racism equals prejudice plus power. Racism equals prejudice plus power. I thought racism was animus toward another racial group, but they had introduced this idea of power, that in order to be a racist, you had to have power to impose it on other people. And that struck me as being very problematic, because it meant that groups like Jews, who were perceived as powerful, could not be victims of racism. And it meant that groups that were perceived as powerless could not be perpetrators of racism. And how is that good for us in our understanding of each other? And so I realized that was a problem. I wrote about it the first time 21 years ago.
Wow.
I wrote an op-ed about why that was dangerous. I wrote a memo to my colleagues even earlier than that, saying that I was starting to see in liberal circles that I swam in, so people talking about America as if it were a white supremacist state, rather than an imperfect country trying to live up to its own high ideals. That was how we used to talk about America. And now it was, the narrative had been sort of twisted into something completely different. And I thought it was very dangerous. And I expressed that to my colleagues. And some listened, some thought I was off my rocker or whatever. But that was that was what I was trying to get across. In 2016, when I started my last job, I wrote an article on a topic called intersectionality. And I wrote that people were connecting causes between, Black Lives Matter and the Palestinian Solidarity Movement and sex violence and climate change, and that was not good for us, because the radical anti-Israel narrative was being lumped together with all these other causes. And it caused a firestorm. I think there were 9 opinion pieces written in response to that one opinion piece that I wrote. So I've been thinking about this and talking about it for a long time. That doesn't mean I've always gone to bat. That doesn't mean I always aggressively opposed it. There were times that I sort of went along with it in the interest of expediency or whatever. I didn't want to get canceled. But over time, I realized, especially after George Floyd, that I really could no longer do the work that I love to do anymore.
One of the things I don't know any of the statistics or research on this, but it's something I get a YouTube comment about once a week that says Jewish academics have created a lot of these thought patterns, these racial division and CRT, and they bring it back to Jewish thinkers and academics. And so,
Yeah.
do you have a response to that? And what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. So this ideology has been brewing for many years. I mean, it goes, to the 1960s when postmodern thought became more and more popular in academic circles. Some of those early thinkers were called, were Jews that were part of it's called the Frankfurt School in Germany, and they then spread out through academia. Many of them left Germany and entered American academia. People like Herbert Marcuse and and Gramsci and others. These were postmodern philosophers who had an opinion about the way the world worked, and they believed that knowledge, as we thought we understood it, was really just power trying to embed itself in discourses of society. And our job was to sort of recognize that everything that we thought we knew was actually just a result of powerful actors conspiring to keep us down. That was sort of the postmodernist worldview. It changed and morphed over time, and there were Jews involved in that, and there were other people involved in it. But here's the truth. Look, Jews are always involved in every social movement, every intellectual movement. They're involved on both sides. They're capitalists and they're communists. Some of the leading voices against wokeism today are Jews. Barry Weiss, Jewish. Steven Pinker at Harvard, Jewish. Jonathan Haidt, Jewish. I could go on. Sam Harris, Jewish. A lot of these are leading figures, public intellectuals who are opposed to wokeism. So if you're looking for Jews who are part of a woke movement, you'll find them. If you're looking for Jews who are opposed to wokeism, you'll find them. That's because Jews tend to be involved in all sorts of movements. Some I support, some I oppose. And I think the anti-Semitic imagination wants to say, well, this is the essential Jew, is the person who's spreading postmodern ideology or wokeism. And any Jew who's opposed to it, they don't count. It's just the ones that were involved in it. Those are the ones that count. And it's okay. That's the way that, conspiracy theories work.
Confirmation bias.
Very much so.
Yeah. So as you've been having these conversations for a long time with people and trying to make people aware of the issue as you've been seeing it develop, what have you found has been effective in opening people's minds to seeing this from your perspective?
Yeah. So there's two things. There's one, getting people to see it, and there's another thing, getting people to act on it, right? There's a lot of people who agree with me, but they agree with me in silence because they don't want to be called out for saying something in public, that they don't want to be called a racist. They don't want to be called immoral. So they say nothing about it. So I'll start there. Why don't I start there? Because I think the project there is to get those people to speak out. And I always say courage is contagious. Once one person is courageous, it makes it a little easier for somebody else to follow suit. And so I always say now, I used to think I was in like the anti-woke business, but now I realize I'm in the courage business, right? My business is actually to get people to be courageous. So I think about ways I can do that. And one of the things I found is that there's safety in numbers. And so if you can and our goal is to get a critical mass of people, whatever that is, in institutions to push back against the radical ideology. And if you can do that, you can really neutralize some of the worst aspects of this ideology. But it requires you to go and figure out, who the people are who agree with you. And that's hard because the people are scared to talk. I call it the awkward dance. You have to sort of, ask them a little bit about themselves and where they're thinking, and you introduce it. And before you know it, you find out you're just fast friends and you agree on everything. So that's number one. And then there's a lot of things you can do within that sort of larger strategy of making people exercise their courage. Then there's this other audience of people who probably might find this ideology or what they're hearing about oppressed oppressors to be a bit odd or troubling. They're not sure they understand it, but they want to go along with it because they're good people, because good people should have empathy toward people who are oppressed. And I think there you have to point out, like, there's other ways of being empathetic than buying into an ideology that actually harms perhaps the people it pretends to be helping. I care about downtrodden. I care about people who have been marginalized. I want to lift people up. I just don't want to be told that there's only one explanation for why some people are doing better than other people, because it's not true. And because it stifles the actual ability to the kind of conversations that might lead to actual solutions. And so to expose them to that, to help them decode the ideology, to make them understand that they're not just being nice when they support somebody's agenda that holds that, that all white people are oppressors or all Jews are oppressors. They're not being nice when they do that. They're being wrong, and they're being illiberal when they do it. Nice people can do illiberal things. They can do things in the name of empathy that are actually quite stifling, quite bad for society. And getting them to see that over time and helping them think through what's at stake here, I think can bring some of them along. But my primary concern are the people who already agree with me, because there's so many of those people, and they've been so silenced. So they're the low-hanging fruit in all this.
Well, I like how you point out that courage is contagious. And have you seen examples of that in this movement, if you will?
Oh, yes. I mean, sometimes it's like with an individual that I've encountered who is reluctant to speak out, and I sort of talk them through their anxieties about it. Sometimes I see sort of the rapid shifts of, in trends. So let me give you examples of both. I met a teacher, a Jewish teacher, who told me privately that there was some very disturbing pedagogical materials being taught in the schools, and explain what they were. They were things like white supremacy culture framework, which holds that being at work on time, or having a norm of being at work at time or school on time, is a white supremacy value. And so he says that's being taught to every teacher in the school system, that then imparted to students. And I said, so would you be willing to share about that publicly? I don't know. I'm not sure it's a good idea. Are you worried about losing your job? Oh, no, I'm pretty close to retirement. I said, okay, so you're not worried about losing your job. So what's holding you back? Well, I'm worried that Antifa will show up at my door. I said, Antifa. I said, I've been doing this for 3 years. I wrote a book about it. I'm as out front about this as you can be, and nobody from Antifa has ever knocked at my door. Okay, so I think you probably don't need to worry. A sigh of relief, So I get them to sort of understand that maybe some of their fears of speaking out were irrational, and that they could take more risks than they thought they could. And then sometimes I remind them of things like, there are people like Navalny who put their life on the line for what they believe in. The great Jewish refusenik from Soviet Union who spent 9 years in the Gulag, Natan Sharansky, who wrote the foreword to my book, says that no one is going to disappear you because you speak your mind in America. This is not the Soviet Union. So maybe more of us should be able to speak our minds and take some risks to preserve our democratic culture, right? So that's one thing I try to do to bring people along. But you'll also see this happen en masse as ideas start to proliferate in the system. After December 5th, when those 3 university presidents testified before Congress, there was a sort of a groundswell of activism. People started to see for the first time that diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracies in universities in particular were highly problematic. They were enforcing a certain ideology on the entire campus. They were shutting down academic discourse and academic freedom. And they were turning our universities into bastions of nonsense and radicalism. And that, and again, that happened sort of en masse in society when there was sort of a collective recognition. I think that changed the dynamics, and more people then were willing to speak out about radical DEI than they were before.
When you talk about that happening en masse and the collective recognition, that's something that I've thought a lot of people don't, if they have been removed from academia and they haven't been following this, when they hear people like us talking about it, they think we're exaggerating. Yes. And so there's a failure of recognition of the problem, I think.
There is. And, a lot of people solve the problem more acutely now than they did before. Maybe they said, oh, you're exaggerating. Oh, there's a little anthropology professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, that's teaching something bad. It's not such a big deal. Come on. It's not such a big deal. But then all of a sudden they see these protests erupt. They see 31 student groups at Harvard University blame Israel for the massacre that was just committed against Israelis. And they say, what's wrong here? I think that shocked a lot of people, and they could no longer sort of shunt it off to the side after there was just so much evidence of what's gone wrong. I mean, 2 days ago or so, the dean of Berkeley Law School was having one of his student dinners, and these students interrupted him and started at his own home and started yelling, chanting slogans about Israel and Palestine and what have you. And enough of this footage has sort of found its way into the popular conscience that I think it's starting to turn public opinion in a way that allows us to be more forceful in our advocacy.
Have you seen a shift in how the left right, the polarization in recent times, with a lot of the left taking such a I guess an anti-Israel stance?
I mean, there's been a steady decline on the left toward Israel. I mean, you could look at the Pew survey for the last 20 some years, not the Pew, Gallup survey for the last 20 some years. It's been they've been doing Gallup surveys, I think, since 2001, and you can see that that in comparative sympathy, in other words, are you more sympathetic to Palestinians or Israelis? Even if you looked at the Democratic Party numbers, it was relatively usually 2-1 in favor of Israel. For the first time in 2023, that changed, and a majority of Democrats said that they were more sympathetic to the Palestinians. So you can really see a huge shift on the left here. I think Israel's gained some admirers on the right over time as well. So it's sort of neutralized the overall picture. So if you look at the recent Harvard-Harris polls and so forth, you see collectively Americans support Israel. Something like 80% of Americans say that they support Israel's war effort. So no matter what you hear in the press and the like, many Americans are quite sympathetic. But the trend lines, particularly on the left, are not good. The trend lines among young people are not good. And I think there's a lot of concern by me and others that we've got to figure out how to talk about these issues and do what we can to sort of neutralize some of this hemorrhaging.
It's been such an interesting thing to witness, I guess, sociopolitically. And I have to admit that it's not an area that I have a lot of knowledge on. So, but it certainly has been quite a phenomenon to see all these university students erupting in these big protests, and these, it's been kind of eye-opening. So,
there's a lot going on there. You have the growth of this sort of radical ideology that we've been talking about, that which will not be named. We have DEI bureaucracies that are sort of giving further power to it. You have university administrators who don't view Jews as a legit marginalized community, so don't offer any of the same protections they would of Jews that they would any other minority group. And you have also, by the way, money coming from Arab countries like Qatar that are funding radical programs. And you have a lot of Arab students that are being heavily subsidized by their own governments to come and study here, and they tend to be more radical. And they join forces with these radical progressive students in what we sometimes call the Red-Green Alliance of radical Muslims and radical progressives that are protesting campus. And I think it creates sort of the perfect storm that we've witnessed after October 7th.
So there's actually Arab funding for these programs in the universities, you're saying?
Oh, yeah. There's billions of dollars have come from Qatar into universities like Cornell. I think Cornell is one of the biggest offenders, if you consider that an offender. I do. University of Texas A&M, I think they just stopped their program in Qatar itself, but they've been actively involved with Qatar. It's spread across the university system. It's billions of dollars, and sometimes it's sort of hidden because Qatar sets up these foundations that they then use to funnel the money into universities. And while we have laws on our books that require universities to declare foreign sources of funding, they haven't been very well implemented. And as a result, a lot of universities have sort of, skirted around those laws and haven't really reported it where their money is coming from.
Well, that's really interesting, and really, that's really interesting. Speaking of university funding, I know we saw such an uptick in some of the, for lack of a better word, woke ideologies or critical social justice ideology, CRT, and the gender ideologies that have been rampant in academia and in K through 12 as well. We saw such a jump in that around 2020. And I noticed it in my school. I was in graduate school prior to that, and then I was still in the same graduate program after that. And I watched as things became much more blatantly and overtly political. And the syllabi were changed so that we had these one of the issues that I raised was that there was a civility pledge that was introduced that I had to sign in order to take a class, and this included it included pledging to intersectional ideology. So
Yeah.
I've wondered if there was some tie-in between the just everywhere all at once seeing this increase and funding. If there was something in the HERF funds, the higher education relief funds for COVID, that also required schools to add in some ideological components. Do you know anything about that?
I don't look, I think this has been brewing well before COVID. I mean, even, I was experiencing this very intensely. Now, is funding, does funding play a role? I think federal funding, by the way, that requires K through 12 programs that want federal funds, or colleges to meet certain DEI requirements, are a huge factor in this. They drive this. They created the bureaucracy. Certain large foundations, American foundations, that Ford Foundation and some of these other foundations drive this as well. And I think you have foreign money as well, as we've already spoken about. But look, this is a homegrown ideology. Like, it's not just a matter of like a few people behind the scenes driving this. There are some people who think it is. I think it's very complex. Money plays a role, but this ideology has percolated through, universities over the course of decades, and not all those people had money behind them. They were just ideas that spread like wildfire through first in our universities, jumped the lab, entered the larger societal bloodstream. So yes, money matters, but it's not, I don't think, the main driving force. It's a driving force.
No, I think you're making a really good point. And that's something that I only recognized retrospectively, because my experience was I was in law school in 2010. And then I took a break from academia for a number of years, and I worked and raised kids. And then I went back to graduate school in 2019, and I felt like I felt like all of the language had changed. Like now we talk about things so differently. Yeah, it was really strange. So for me, it felt very punctuated. It felt like, where are we getting this white privilege talk? When did we start talking about things so blatantly in terms of race, and why are we talking about gender the way we're talking about it? I took a psychology of gender course in undergrad back in the early 2000s, and we didn't have this framework that now seems like it's a given, like it's foundational, and nobody's explaining where it came from. It's just how we talk about things now. And so it really felt like something had changed. But when, I've talked with lots of people about this, and as I've read the source materials, you do see that this was, as you say, percolating in the culture for quite a while. It just seems to have accelerated.
It accelerated around 2013 and 2014. You could read about it in Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. You can read about it in Yashka Monk's book, The Identity Trap. You had sort of this perfect storm. You had the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, and the rise of the Black Lives Matter protest. And you had new social media channels, especially Tumblr, that seemed to accelerate a lot of these trends among college students and the like. And I was at that time head of a pro-Israel campus-oriented organization that worked with college students around the United States. And I could tell that there had been a tremendous ideological shift from like 2013 to 2014. And other people like Greg Lukianoff, who is the CEO of FIRE, saw the same thing at that time and said, there's something weird going on. Like these students are changing their attitudes very rapidly. And I think that sort of continued unabated until 2020, when the George Floyd racial reckoning came, and all of a sudden, people who started gaining power in institutions really used it to sort of cement their power. And many institutions signed on what I call the dotted line of deference to anti-racism and DEI and the like. And they all put out their signs, and they all pledged their fealty to the cause. and hired people that, brought in new DEI consultants, or hired, the vice president of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or whatever it is that they did that sort of locked them into this ideological framework. And it allowed a lot of really crazy, illiberal, stifling stuff to happen in corporations and institutions. People were getting canceled. It was sort of a moment where we handed power to somebody who used it to full effect, and it was bound to create a backlash, and it has. But a lot of the damage has been done. Like, a lot of these institutions went so far, are so deep in, that they're sort of stuck in DEI land. And I think it's hard for them to extricate themselves, even if they want to. Some want to. Some want to sort of tamp it down slowly. Some corporations that said, well, maybe we shouldn't have, jumped so far and so fast, now are willing to take a second look at it. But a lot of institutions, they just like empowered people. Now that is their institutional culture. So I think it's a heavy lift to try to get them to change.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things I wonder is there a way forward for a lot of these institutions? Do you think that it's possible for them to reform and save their reputations and come back from this, or are they in too deep and we have to rely on developing alternative institutions at this point?
Yeah, I think it's both and, in a way. Like, I think there are institutions that are just too far gone, right? And there are institutions that I know about where the CEO, by the way, told me that they had really jumped on the anti-racism bandwagon, and yet now are sharing articles that I've written at their senior staff retreats. And so I think that there are organizations that had sort of what I would call core liberal values, right? Liberal values in this case meaning, free exchange of ideas, open inquiry, and the like. And they got temporarily eclipsed with anti-racism. And now those two things are sort of fighting out within the culture of the organization. And I think those places can be redeemed. I think there are some places that just went so far down the woke rabbit hole, if you will, that they're probably irredeemable. And there were some places that were so progressive already before this sort of ideological trend set in, that they love it where they're at. I mean, this is just a new way for them to do what they love to do. By the way, interestingly though, even among some of the progressive advocacy organizations that you would think would be like completely behind the ideology, there's a bit of pushback. There are people who say we got so enamored by this ideologies that we stopped actually trying to do progressive politics and progressive advocacy. Like, if all you do is spend time talking about who has power in your own staff, you don't actually go out there and fight for reproductive rights or climate change or whatever else. You end up in a standstill. People like Ryan Grimm of The Intercept have written about this phenomenon. He himself is an extreme progressive, but he thinks that this ideology has gotten all these progressive groups way off the mark.
Oh, it's really interesting. Yeah, it's sort of derailed them and sent them into little eddies of self-flagellation.
Exactly. Which is good in a way, but also, also just a sign of the times too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Are you optimistic for the future going forward after this?
I'm sort of an optimist by nature, and I believe in America's capacity for renewal. I have to say that as America becomes more ideological on both extremes of the political spectrum, and I think there's problems on the right too, it's hard to see how you get your way out, an easy way out. Like, I think political parties have stopped learning. It used to be that if your political party put out a radical candidate, someone who was, let's say, far right of center or far left of center, and you got clobbered in an election, the next election, the moderates would win out, and then they would put forward somebody who was actually electable. I think that process has broken down. There's sort of political learning has ended in many ways, and I think that's very dangerous and scary to me. But I do think that there are signs of renewal. I think that the backlash against university cultures is real and gaining steam, and I think that there are going to be efforts to try to restore some sanity to universities. It won't happen everywhere. It won't take us from a D- to a B+ overnight, but it might take us from a D- to a C at some point. Maybe then we'll aim for the B. So I think that there's possibilities. I can't imagine us being sort of stuck in this ridiculous ideological moment forever. That seems unlikely.
Mhm.
The question is, will we destroy ourselves first before we can fix ourselves?
Mhm. Yeah, that is a question. And you mentioned working in K through 12 or working with K through 12 educators, and something that I hear quite a bit about. My kids are homeschooled, so I've decided to opt out of that system at this point. But so many people who do have kids in schools are really concerned about the curriculum that's being put in front of their kids, and how that threatens their children specifically, but also even those of us who've managed to take our kids out of school still face the fact that the entire generational cohort that their kids are going to grow up with are heavily steeped in ideological curriculum. And
Yeah, yeah.
what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, they are heavily steeped in it. Obviously it shows up more in certain places than other places. I mean, um, small towns in red states are much less likely to be fully ideologically steeped. That doesn't mean the ideology won't show up. I just think that they're less likely to experience it, the full effect of it. I was listening to hearings at the Evanston city public schools, and one parent after another was talking about how proud they were that the school put on this liberatory framework of education, and you see that obviously in California, both Northern and Southern California, and New York City schools. So we're seeing these hot spots. I think it exists everywhere, but we're seeing places like, Minneapolis and St. Paul and Boston and the like. These are traditionally very blue areas. I live in a blue area, Montgomery County, Maryland, right outside the DC area. Also, again, hot spot here in many ways. And these are places where there's been some institutional capture, where a group of radical teachers, educators, administrators have sort of stepped into the breach and are now pushing an alternative ideological agenda and pretending and gaslighting everybody else, telling them that there's nothing there to see, that this is just, teaching about history or something. And it's ridiculous. I mean, anybody who's paid any attention to what schools were teaching knows that there's been a huge shift in direction, and that shift is part of a much larger ideological project. And we have every right to push back. Now, people shouldn't be rude, they shouldn't threaten people, but organizing ourselves and pushing back, absolutely we should do that. And we're seeing this in the Jewish community now as well, because you have a lot of American Jews who, they're pretty liberally minded people. They're not but all of a sudden their kids are bringing something home, and it might start with, on Israel, like the Palestine toolkit or whatever. And they say, oh my God, my kids are being indoctrinated in anti-Israel propaganda. And then they start to look into a little more, and they hear from people like me who say, well, it actually goes deeper than that. You're looking at what's above the waterline, the anti-Semitism, but below the waterline, the bummock of the iceberg below the waterline is all this radical ideology that's in our system that's actually conditioning people to want to talk about Israel and quote Palestine in that manner. And we shouldn't go along with it. And so our job is to get parents to see beneath the waterline, to understand that this is not just a function of anti-Semites entering the school system, but rather the onset of a really radical ideology. And that many teachers, not all, but some teachers have bought into, that some students have bought into, that some administrators have bought into, and that it doesn't take a lot of them to actually enforce this ideology on everybody else. And I think that's what we've been seeing. And so, the object now must be to get parents to push back. Some parents only want to push back on the explicit anti-Semitism because, they're for diversity. Why wouldn't they be for diversity? And they don't connect the dots in their minds between radical DEI and anti-Semitism. And, we're not going to win everybody over at any point, but if we can get a higher percentage of those people to understand that it goes deeper than that, and to join the fight against these radical ideologies, I think we'll gain some ground here.
Well, and tying this back into your earlier point about how this has been creeping up in our culture for quite some time. One of my, I guess I had when I was in graduate school, I was older than the other students. Most of them, there were a few people who were my age and older, but most of them were pretty fresh out of college. And I was in my early 40s. And so one of my thoughts was, I was looking around at all these people who seemed to accept this and speak this language very easily without questioning it. Whereas for me, it felt very foreign and very wrong. what we were talking about. And so one of my thoughts was, well, they have been exposed to this throughout their education, so they've been kind of absorbing these ideas and these ways of thinking for quite some time. And when I talked with my daughter about this, she's almost 26, and so when she was in high school or middle school and they did sex ed, she told me that they actually did the genderbread person back then. If you know what that is, that's like like gender metaphor that they use to teach kids. And I was really stunned to find that that had been in her educational material that long ago, because we're talking at least 10 years ago at this point. And so I wonder what the impacts on culture at large are going to be of having, even if we're able, now that it's, like you say, above the water, the iceberg is the tip of the iceberg, we can see it, we can start to talk about it, but it's been under there for quite some time. So what impacts are these going to have culturally on the American culture going forward in generations to come?
We're already seeing it, right?
Yeah.
We're seeing it in the mental health crisis of young people, right? Who I think, even if they're not being conditioned all the time into sort of radical ideology, even if they're not, putting on keffiyehs and showing up at the Hamas protest, they've started to see themselves as victims of the system. It sort of undermines their sense of agency and resilience. And those messages, I think, have profound effects on the way that they see the world, the way they see themselves. And I think it accounts, this larger cultural ideological shift accounts for a lot of the crisis that we're seeing in mental health among young people. And it's accelerated, of course, by social media and early access to social media and the rewiring of the American childhood, as Jonathan Haidt puts it. So I think that it's having profound effects. It's having profound effects on our politics. I mean, now you have a much more robust far left wing that, practices a lethal form of identity politics. I think that identity politics on the left also creates a reaction on the right, a kind of identity politics on the right. So if every group is going to have a grievance linked to their identity, their ethnicities, you're going to have white people who, instead of seeing themselves as Americans, which is what I would like them to see themselves, now develop a kind of white identity politics that become proud of their whiteness instead of their Americanness. And I think that then it becomes a vicious cycle of identity politics that poisons both ends of the political spectrum. And so I think that that affects our culture profoundly, and it makes it harder for people to talk to each other. I mean, I came into Washington, D.C. area in the world of advocacy in the early 1990s. And I remember even in those days, like members of Congress from the other parties, they would scream at each other in public and then go and play racquetball, with each other. And they lived in the same apartments. Now they don't talk to each other. I mean, so the political has become social. It used to be that Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill would have, scotch in the White House, but you wouldn't see that today, because everything has been politicized by the current culture that we're in. And I think that's very dangerous. So there's sort of the fundamental conversation has broken down, and people don't know who they can trust, and they don't trust any source of information anymore. And so you end up with a really dangerous form of politics that tears people apart and tears the fabric of society apart at the seams. So I think we're going through that, and it's going to take people who are thoughtful and rational and willing to talk to people who have different views than them to work this out. And that's very hard when part of the political spectrum on the far left says, I have all the answers to everything. And it's based on who has power and who doesn't. And I don't need to talk to anybody else. My job is to impose that on everybody else. I think that is a huge stumbling block in sort of rebuilding our political culture, rebuilding our social fabric.
Yeah. So how do we as people who see the problem with this and are concerned about this, how do we present a positive vision for the future and help to sort of undo some of the grievance-based cultural identity that we've developed as Americans?
Yeah, I think, first of all, we should practice a level of civility. And I know civility can mean different things, but civility, like, look, my neighbor may vote differently than I. I think we should try to depoliticize our society. We've allowed all these institutions to become sort of platforms for performance, right? So, the university is no longer just about teaching kids to pursue truth or whatever. It's now about all your political stuff. Your church or your synagogue has become a platform for your politics.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we should try to return some of our institutions to their original purposes and missions, and take politics out of some segments of our society, and push for that as much as we can. We should model that in our own behavior too. Like, yes, there are times I get really snarky myself. Okay, I can't help it, whatever. But I'm trying not to do that, and I try not to use really harsh language in describing people I disagree with. I love the phrase, "I think about it differently," rather than "I disagree with you," because I want, what are you going to tell me? I can't think about it differently than you? They may say that, but they sound ridiculous in the process. I think that we've got to start rebuilding a sense like a American middle. And by middle, that doesn't mean that you're equidistant from right or left or whatever. It just means people who are able to talk to each other, even and especially when they disagree with each other. And so finding ways to do that, there's organizations like Braver Angels that were set up specifically to bring people, liberals and conservatives, together. And when they do that, you're sort of strengthening the center right and the center left at the same time, because those people can talk to each other. If you're so far right that you can't talk to somebody from the left and you're just going to make fun of them or call them libtards or whatever, and you're so far left that you're going to see anybody as deplorable or whatever, there's no conversation there. So, let's start rebuilding the ability to talk to each other. And that means that starts with us as individuals, and then building institutions that reflect those values as well.
I really like the phrase, "I think about it differently." I think that's a wonderful suggestion.
Yeah, I've been using it a lot. And the other day I gave a speech, and afterwards I were doing Q&A around the table, and this woman said, "I think about it differently." And I laughed. I said, "Very good. I don't care what you say now. You get points." Because it was in my book. It was I had written a book, and I had that phrase in my book, and she had read the book. So
she learned.
She learned.
That's great. I'm going to borrow that one. I really like it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really appreciate your optimism, and it's true. I think that what you're saying about building up the middle, it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of wisdom in that, and pulling institutions back from this political mission they all seem to have adopted in lockstep. And
exactly.
Yeah, there is this tendency. I think also one thing I've been worried about with all of this is that as you push, you create a reaction. So you've got narrative and counter narrative, and that just increases the polarization. So really something that brings things back to civility. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, we will never vanquish our enemies, our political enemies. They aren't going away. Liberals and left wingers will never go away. Right wingers are not going to disappear just because people wish them away. We're always going to be there. The question is, how can our society cope with its differences? And do we have a system, and do we have a conversation that allows us to maximize our ability to work together? At times it's good that there can be differences. Somebody can win and somebody can lose in a political fight, but how do we manage that? And how do we talk about each other in that process? And again, there's no utopian ideal here. Like, we know that there's always going to be a measure of incivility. We know there's going to be a measure of gridlock or of liberalism, but there are better and worse ways to do it. And I think our political culture was way better 30 years ago than it is now. And even 10 years ago was better, not by much, but significantly better. And again, I don't need to go back to the past, but I think we can sort of recoup some of the past there and understand that, yeah, it was better when members of Congress from different parties were able to play racquetball with each other.
Well, I like that vision a lot, and I hope we can find something more like that. Where can people find your work online?
So we have a website. It's JILV as in Victor.org. That's Jewish Institute for Liberal Values.org. I've written a lot of articles, so you can always Google my name. And as I said, there's another David Bernstein, so be careful. But in fact, I one time went to speak at a synagogue where I realized I was almost canceled. They almost pulled the rug from the talk. And it turns out they thought I was the other David Bernstein. So they had read something that he had written. But I have written a number of articles in the Jewish Journal. I've written articles, Wall Street Journal, and Quillette magazine, which is a great magazine that looks into some of these really left-wing ideological trends. These are places where I've written a lot of and I continue to write. In fact, I have a deadline this weekend that I have to tend to at some point.
Do you have any final thoughts that we should make sure to include before we say goodbye?
Yeah, well, I would just say that take some time to think about to entertain difference and ideas that are different than your own. Even if I think that we get so polarized ourselves in this process. It's so easy for somebody who's fighting the culture wars to forget to actually allow themselves to be challenged. We just end up picking our political tribe. I think to keep yourself fresh, spend some time reading points of view that are either to the polar opposite of you, or even better, that disagree with you 20% of the way. I find the best arguments that I have are not with people who I disagree with 100%, but people who I disagree with about 20% of the way, because then we're in the same universe. I'm not arguing with somebody who thinks that, that Israel should be destroyed or that America is the worst country on earth. I'm arguing with somebody who has a slightly different perspective on various issues than I do, who thinks there's more racism than I do in society, who thinks there's less anti-Semitism than I do in society, who thinks that there's less polarization than I do in society, who is opposed to universal health care, or someone who supports universal health care. You start to, and then have those discussions. Stop categorizing them and think that they're your enemy just because they disagree, and start listening to them and trying to navigate complex conversations. Because if we're all better critical thinkers, then we're going to be less susceptible to these radical trends.
My dad has a phrase that he likes to say, that he says, I agree 100% with 80% of what he says.
That's great.
So, yeah,
that's great. I think if we abide by that, we'll go a long way as a society.
Yeah, it's good advice. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, David. I've really enjoyed speaking with you.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me.